Hello and welcome to session 5 of Peter Goes to Rome. We're looking today at Peter as bishop in Rome, and I'm going to put my slides on here. This class has had one of its purposes and goals being to supplement the Sunday morning preaching of 1 Peter by offering background so that two, we can better understand the person, life, and ministry of the Apostle Peter. And then 3, make connections between the first century setting of Rome and our context today. Overall, this class has looked at the timeline of Peter's life, the relationship of Peter and Jesus, and then Peter's apostolic ministry. We'll be doing Peter and Paul in the future, although there is some overlap today with that. And then last week we looked at the city and empire of Rome. Today we're looking at Peter as the bishop of Rome, and then we'll consider Peter's legacy. So when we look at what it means for Peter to have been the bishop of Rome, we have here on the map Galilee, where Peter grew up and lived and where he met Jesus, and Galilee on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. Peter from an occupied place, as the Roman military was present in the time that he grew up, and he makes his way over to Rome and becomes the leader of the church there, at least according to history. Now, the New Testament does not specifically call Peter the bishop of Rome. 2 words, Peter does identify himself as an apostle, and as we saw, the Gospels and Luke identify him as an apostle. But in the New Testament, we have 2 words that are used for the leaders of the church or local churches, elders, overseers, and what we translate as bishop. And the main word is presbyteros. And you can hear in that Greek term, meaning an elder, an overseer, you hear our word for Presbyterian, meaning churches governed by elders. And we are in the Reformed tradition, and the Reformed tradition has a council of pastors, elders, and deacons. And our Reformed tradition came out of the Netherlands. The Presbyterian Church in the United States comes out of Scotland, and they're basically the same church structure and polity, but that word Presbyterian comes from this, presbyteros, which again means the leadership or rule by elders. Now, the other word in the New Testament, used a little less frequently, is episkopos, which basically has the same meaning, but again, you can hear the name of another denomination in there, Episcopal, which is episkopoi is the plural of overseer or bishop. And when we think of the reason that the Episcopal Church, that's the church I grew up in the United States, has that name is because it's the Church of England. But when the colonies broke away from England and wanted to, maintain working here, they couldn't call themselves, or it couldn't call itself the Church of England anymore because the U.S. was breaking from England, and so it couldn't go by the name Anglican Church. So it called itself the Episcopal Church, meaning a church that is governed by bishops. And so when you hear about the Episcopal Church, you'll hear about the House of Bishops sometimes and the decisions they make. Now, those are words in the New Testament used for the leaders of a local church, the leaders of a church in a city. But even by the time that you get to Paul appointing Timothy and Titus to oversee the leaders of different churches in an area, you begin to have a sense that that office was developing from just being a local leader to being a leader over more than one church. So we even see that development in the New Testament. So the questions raised, was Peter the bishop of Rome? Because the Bible doesn't explicitly say that he went to Rome. We see him in Acts. We see him have a little bit of movement, but he's at the He's at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, but by that time, really the focus is on Paul. It doesn't, we see Paul go to Rome in Acts. We don't see Peter go to Rome. But in this letter, as we've already seen, Peter writes as if he is writing from Babylon, the code word for Rome. And so it appears that he's writing or dictating the letter from there. Now, an early apocryphal book called the Acts of Peter, which is not included in the canon of Scripture, does have him go to Rome, but that's not considered inspired Scripture, so we don't rely on that. And the question is how much the historian Eusebius relied on the apocryphal Acts, because Eusebius does state that both Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome. And so early church history begins to share that or pass on the tradition that Peter did make his way to Rome and was the leader of the church there and was martyred there under the Emperor Nero. Now, I haven't done a lot of investigation into this, but I think I go with the church tradition. Obviously, I'm not Roman Catholic. I'm a Protestant pastor, and so I don't look at the papacy as the descendant of the work of Peter in the way that a Roman Catholic person would, but I defer to the overall stream of history on that Peter did end his days in Rome, and he effectively was the leader of the church there. So looking at Peter, we think of him for what it meant to be a bishop in Rome. What did his ministry look like? In chapter 2 of 1 Peter, he writes to he's writing to several churches in Asia Minor, but also this would be what he applies to the people in Rome, if that's where he's writing from. And in chapter 2, he says, verse 11, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." So notice in this, he talks to his audience, these early churches, and again, that would include the way that he would interact with the church in Rome, that he calls the followers of Christ to an allegiance that's not to the earthly kingdom, it's an allegiance to the heavenly kingdom, because he calls them foreigners and exiles. And that's the way he started his letter, and he's emphasizing it here. You are not of this world in a sense. You're foreigners and exiles. Your citizenship is in heaven. But notice too, he doesn't call them to withdraw from society. Peter grew up as a Jewish person in the first century. And when you look at the four main groups that we see, at least three of them in the New Testament, you had the Pharisees, which Paul was a member of. So, the teachers of the law, the focus on keeping the law and weekly synagogue worship. Then you had the Sadducees, who were tied into the power structure with the temple, and the Zealots, who were wanted to use violence to drive the Romans out. And then the fourth group were the Essenes. They were the ones that withdrew from society and went out into the wilderness. And they were expecting the end of all things to come, the day of the Lord to happen. And it is because of their withdrawal that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls that have helped scholars with textual criticism and confirming the reliability of the Hebrew scriptures. And so Peter would have been familiar with those four streams, and he is not buying into those. On the one hand, he recognizes that Jesus died, and there's no longer died as the perfect sacrifice. There's no longer a need for the work of the temple. He is not going to call for people to follow the law as the way to get right with God. And so he's not going to follow the Pharisees on that. And then two, he's not calling for violence, for an overthrow of the current earthly kingdom, like the zealots, and he's not calling for a complete withdrawal. Instead, he says, you're foreigners and exiles, abstain from sinful desires, because Rome, both Greece and Rome, the Greco-Roman society, had a reputation for being a society of indulgence. And that's why even Christianity was attractive to many people, because they had indulged themselves in so many ways and found it lacking. But there's always this temptation there. And so he's calling for them to be countercultural and abstain. But he's concerned too about the witness that they have. So he's not saying for them to completely withdraw from society, but to live good lives among the pagans. So the pagans, the non-Christians who are going to be practicing many different religions, as long as they are seen as legal within the Roman Empire, and that will include emperor worship as well. And Christianity, as it splits off from Judaism, is not a legal religion. And so he doesn't say to hate the pagans. He doesn't say to kill the pagans or go to war with them, but to be exemplary, to live good lives among them. And we'll get to later why he might have this concern. But you see in Peter then this recognizing the context of where his people are at and calling them to live a certain way. And continuing on, he says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is by God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And so Peter just kind of hammers this, submit to those in authority. And so again, he's not calling them to overthrow the current system. And there's this emphasis on the emperor that you have both in verse 13 and verse 17. And this reminds me of Guido de Bray in the 16th century writing the Belgic Confession. He wanted to show the French king that Protestants were not heretics, and Protestants weren't looking to overthrow monarchies. And so Peter, in a sense, living right in the heart of Rome or in the heart of empire in Rome, that these Christians, they're not these revolutionaries trying to actively overthrow the system. In this sense, he would be in agreement with the Apostle Paul in Romans 13, that those who are in authority have been placed there by the sovereign will of God. And so we see him emphasizing that. And as I've said, they're not looking to overturn the existing social order. And so in summary then, it's respect your neighbors, love the church family. I could have put in here, fear God, but I was looking more at their social context. And then honor the emperor and follow authorities. And so this is Peter's pastoring of the first century church, as this letter went out to several churches, but this would also, if he's in Rome, this is what he would be teaching them. And so I wanted to lay this out then to give us a sense for the context of the city of Rome. And what's interesting then too is we see in the following, the passage following what I just shared, Peter goes on with what are called household codes, and those are more associated with Paul, but you have them in First Peter as well. And so First Peter says, he's talked about our being slaves to God. Well, he talks here about slaves submitting to masters, and I'm going to share more detailed information about that in a bit, slaves in the Roman Empire. But he writes, and I'm not putting the whole passage in here, but just the opening verse, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. And so you have, just as Peter is saying to the church, submit to the emperor and all authorities, but those are ultimately under the emperor. So slaves, submit to your immediate authority of your master, even the ones who are harsh. And then wives submitting to husbands. And that's similar to Paul's, I'll show here in a moment. But wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. And so just as you have their witness to their pagan neighbors to be exemplary, so should the actions of a wife win over her husband to Christ. And for a wife, to be a wife in first century Rome put you in a very precarious position, because you didn't have rights, you didn't have financial security apart from your husband. And so Peter is calling on, he's working within the institution of marriage as it was in the first century. And then tells husbands to love their wives in verse 7. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. So in your marriage, you ought to be consistent as a disciple of Christ. And then he speaks to all of you from verse 8 of chapter 3 and on, to the church. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. And so this has the feel of Paul, the way that Paul writes to the churches in his different epistles. And so you see then, I've already mentioned with submitting to the emperor. So you have the emperor and the Senate, depending on the time in the life of the Roman Republic and then empire, whether and to what degree it would have power. Peter would be aware of the political system and political power as he's living in Rome, but then he's working within the existing societal structure that's there, as Paul does. In fact, I thought it would be helpful to compare the household codes of First Peter and then Paul. So you get Peter addressing slaves, wives, husbands, and then all of you, the church. And when we look at Ephesians, we see Paul hitting on those same groups of people, but then having some more. So submit to one another. So the church, this is how you ought to live. And then he goes to wives in chapter 5 of Ephesians, and husbands. And then he deals with children, obey your parents, and then fathers, don't exasperate your children, and showing that while the children are to obey the parents, he only addresses the fathers, shows again that position of the father and husband in the Roman family, Greek and Roman families. And then he goes into slaves, obey your masters, and then Paul deals with the masters, treat your slaves well. And when you take Ephesians and then look also at Philemon, Philemon is the story of the runaway slave Onesimus. Paul meets Onesimus, most likely in Rome, sends him back to Philemon, his owner, and implies that Philemon ought to give Onesimus his freedom, but doesn't demand it. I mean, he really pressures him, but doesn't demand it. And here he doesn't say, free your slaves. And but when you look at these, then I've color coded them. You have both Peter and Paul addressing slaves, addressing wives, addressing husbands, and then telling them to all love one another or submit to one another in the church. And so Peter and Paul then are both addressing Christians living in first century Greco-Roman culture of the Roman Empire. So Peter then is very much a contextual pastor, dealing with society as is. I'm going to be sharing a few quotes here, extended quotes, and so I'm going to be drawing from these two books, William Taberny's Early Christianity in Contexts and Everett Ferguson's Backgrounds of Early Christianity. Now, just going back to these household codes, I'll just note that many Christians today would be disappointed or perplexed by Peter and Paul not being more explicit in the changes that the gospel brings why not? Why not call for the freeing of slaves? And because subsequent history, these texts are the ones that would be used to justify European originated slavery of African peoples. And so, when Peter says slaves submit to your masters, even those harsh ones, those verses would be used to justify the abuses of slavery in more recent history. We're now going to look at the context of the city of Rome in the first century. I'm going to be drawing from early Christianity and contexts. If you didn't see the previous session on Rome and the Roman Empire, I encourage you to watch that video as well for more details. But here, this gives us a snapshot. Approximately 1 million people with various languages, customs, and religions from all over the empire crowded Rome in imperial times. Persons who were more well-to-do lived in villas or domus with floor heating, running water, and sewer pipes, or in luxurious apartments. The majority of the population, however, crowded tenements, insulae, built of brick and wood. The tenements, 5 or 6 floors high, often became deadly fire traps. Most of them had no water or latrines. The ground floors were used as stores, workshops, or storage rooms. The higher one climbed in the tenement houses, the smaller and darker the dwelling units became. Loud noises, foul odors, and crowded conditions were normal. At night, sleep was disturbed by carts clattering under the windows, since Caesar had banned daytime cart traffic from the jammed streets of the city. In the 4th century, more than 44,000 entrances to insulae were counted in Rome, in addition to 1,791 entrances to domus. So that gives you a picture of a crowded, smelly, loud city. It also shows us how Rome, where Peter was working, where the church was active, was a multi-ethnic, multicultural city. And you just think of Peter himself. He's of Jewish background from the far edge of the Roman Empire. Now he's living in that city. And when Peter and Paul both address slavery and talk about how slaves ought to respond to masters, and for Paul, how masters ought to treat their slaves, that's because slavery was present throughout the empire, and the churches would have been made up of people of different groups. That's why Paul's going to say, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. That's slavery. They would have had people who were slaves, and at different times they would have been able to worship as part of a church. And so from Ferguson, we learned that slavery was a basic element in ancient society. Much of the initiative, as well as the work done, belonged to this class. Slavery was very extensive in both the Hellenistic, so Greek, and Roman periods, as the large number of prisoners of war made slaves cheap in Hellenistic Greek and Republican Rome. However, the stable conditions of the early empire made homebred slaves the main source of supply, an expensive procedure. Nonetheless, it is estimated that 1 in 5 of the residents of Rome was a slave. A proposal in the Senate that slaves be required to wear distinctive dress was defeated, lest the slaves learn how numerous they were. And so in this, you get a sense of how ubiquitous slavery was in the empire. And one thing that there would be in common in the 1st century world of slavery with our more modern slavery that we had in the Americas is that much of the labor was carried out by slaves. Now, one big difference, though, is our more modern form of slavery was much more ethnically or race-based, whereas in Rome, it was more class-based, or, as it says here, dependent on being a prisoner of war. Continuing on, it says the condition of slavery might result from war, piracy and brigandage, exposure of a child, that's where a child is set out to die, and Christians would often pick up those child and raise them, sale of a child or self to pay debts, condemnation in the law courts, or birth to a slave mother. An individual acquired slaves by purchase from slave dealers, by inheritance, or by home breeding. A child took the status of the mother. Most slaves seem to have come from the eastern part of the empire, but Germans, Gauls, and Britons were important news sources in the early empire. By and large, the slaves were denationalized and simply became a part of Greco-Roman civilization. The legal status of a slave was that of a thing. Aristotle defined a slave as living property. So again, you see here that even if somebody was from outside the empire, their focus was more on their class as slave rather than their ethnic background. And then depending on birth and depending on whether or not you were able to attain or were granted freedom, that could be passed on. But again, slavery was everywhere. Part of the context that Peter is writing in with Rome is recognizing that the church in Rome could have very well been started by Jews who were present at Pentecost and made their way back to Rome with the message that we found the Messiah. The Messiah was killed and he rose again, and they might have heard it from Peter himself. Either way, there was a presence of Jewish people in Rome, and some of those Jewish people became Christians. And then we see in Acts where the Emperor Claudius kicks out the Jews and out from the city. And so this one couple, Priscilla and Aquila, they meet the Apostle Paul and form a friendship, and they work together as missionaries. And so that is referenced here in early Christianity in context, where it says, following the disruptive events of 49 of the current era or common era, so where the Jewish people were kicked out, it says, and no later than the mid-50s, at the time of Paul's letter to the Romans, the Christians began meeting separately from the Jewish synagogues. And there you see, like in Acts with Paul's usual method, first go to a Jewish synagogue, and if there's not a synagogue in a town, then the gathering of Jews and God-fearers. But eventually the church is going to become distinct. And we see that here. The majority of Roman Christians by then were of non-Jewish descent, although many of these Gentiles may, before their baptism, have been loosely connected with Jewish synagogues as uncircumcised sympathizers with Jewish monotheism. In 64, even Nero could distinguish the Christians from the Jews in the city. And so that's important for us to note, that just as we see throughout the book of Acts, and we see as the background of the epistles, so here in Rome, when Peter's there, although he's of Jewish background, the people that he's going to be leading are going to be primarily Gentiles. They're non-Jewish people, as by that time the church was separating from the synagogue. So continuing on, it says, despite segregation from the worship of the synagogues, the Roman Christians maintained many Jewish traditions and influences in their thinking and teaching. The first epistle of Clement and the book of Hermas exemplify this well. Social contacts between Christians and Jews in the city continued, as the Christian slave Callistus demonstrated in the 180s when he operated a bank with Christian and Jewish customers decades before he became bishop. And then after that reference says, in the 2nd century, a group of Jewish Christians still observed the Torah, withdrawing fellowship from other Christians who did not, but probably maintaining contact with non-Christian Jewish synagogues. Cultural exchanges between Jews and Christians in the fields of theology, art, or catacomb architecture existed throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So it's helpful for us to know that the church in Rome started as part of the Jewish diaspora, the Jews who were present in Rome, but then it grew beyond that community and reflected more the multi-ethnic, multicultural composition of the city. And yet Christians and Jews continued some amount of contact and dialogue and passing back and forth through those early centuries. One of the reasons that we see Peter show concern for how Christians lived among the pagans is because by the time we get to the 60s in that first century, the decade of the 60s, that the Christians did not have a good reputation. And so it tells here in early Christianity in context, in 64 of the current era, a great fire severely damaged 10 of Rome's 14 regions. Nero unjustly accused the Christians of arson, crucifying and burning many of them as torches in the Vatican gardens, thus imposing the traditional punishment for arsonists of being burned alive. Many contemporaries suspected Nero himself of setting the city on fire because he needed space for his construction plans. He designed his new palace, the vast Golden House, to stretch all the way from the Palatine to the slopes of the Esquiline. Now, in that, you see how when there was such a fire that we saw earlier, the tenements were very susceptible to fires. And so, of course, the phrase Nero fiddled while Rome burned, there's this major fire and Nero blames the Christians and punishes the Christians, and partly because they were already at that time not in a good view in society's light. Continuing on, it says, although the Christians were innocent, the fact that they could so easily be scapegoated shows what a bad reputation they had. They were disliked in the pagan environment because they were as different as the Jews. Paul drastically illustrates this bad reputation under which particularly the early Christian missionaries suffered. We have become like the rubbish of the world, the dregs of all things. So 1 Corinthians 4. Bad press, immigrant status, being an unimportant ingredient in a melting pot city of people from all over the empire, this was early Christianity in the city of Rome. And I decided not to put it in here, but actually Christians tended to live not in the center of the city, but more kind of in not so nice places in ringing around the city. It is probable, so continuing on, it is probable that the Apostle Peter was among Nero's crucified victims in 64, and it has the references there. In the mid-2nd century at the latest, that is no more than 3 generations after Peter's death, Christians appear to have identified a simple grave in the Vatican necropolis as Peter's burial place. This, however, is all that can be said in a scientifically responsible way about the history of this tomb prior to 160. Around that year, Roman Christians decorated the simple grave with a modest monument before it gradually became the center of more and more architectural activity. Today, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica soars high above it. And according to First Clement, Paul also suffered martyrdom in Rome. And so the Vatican becomes what we know today as the center and headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church, and even a political state to itself, over the burial site of Peter, or the supposed burial site, which is relatively early in history that it was identified as such. But Peter then has this concern for how Christians are viewed by the pagans, partly because they might already have been gaining a negative reputation. I think for us then, we look at ourselves and consider how Christians are viewed in society. And even this past week, I heard about somebody who's been a professed Christian is arrested and charged with something horrific, and it just adds to the view in our day that Christians talk one way but do another thing. And so I think to some degree both Peter and Paul were trying to address that people are free in Christ, but that doesn't mean you live however and do whatever you want. Instead, you live holy lives for God because you are giving a witness to your neighbor. And so some of the animosity toward the early Christians would have been because they would not go along with life in Rome. But some of that was probably because of their own doing and not being consistent in how they lived. So having seen all that background for first century city of Rome and Peter leading the church there, I think we have a few takeaways. The first is that Peter acted as a missionary bishop. He didn't just care for the people under his charge, but he cared for what their witness looked like and produced. So he was concerned for the witness of the church and how it was received. He doesn't write against those pagans as hateful towards them. Instead, he wants God to be glorified in how the pagans respond to the good works and lives of the Christians. And so in this sense, because he's so concerned about the witness of the Christians, and as they are to carry out this making disciples throughout the world, he's acting as a missionary bishop. Also, as I've noted, Peter did not seek to overturn the social order, but also called Christians to live as a countercultural group. So on the one hand, they're not trying to remake society, not through force, not by taking over the Senate or the emperor's seat, but also he's not saying, yeah, do whatever the Romans do. Instead, they're to be different. And so for those who might want radical revolution, they're going to be disappointed in Peter. For those who want to just compromise and go along with whatever, Peter says, no, we're different. We're exiles, we're aliens, we're foreigners, and our allegiance is to the kingdom of heaven. For us, then, we have to consider what it meant for Peter to lead Christians in a pre-Christian pagan society. And for us, as we live in what's called a post-Christian or secular, well, post-Christian and secular society, Christianity is still very strong and present in the United States. And yet we also live in a society that is multi-ethnic, pluralistic. And so we have the tension of how much should Christianity be in the public square and be the assumed cultural religious conscience or the overall accepted religion. And that tension goes on. Now, one example then for us to compare is Peter does not want to overturn the institution of slavery. It seems like Peter and Paul just accept it overall. And again, you can go into Philemon and wrestle there with whether or not Paul is demanding that Philemon release Onesimus without saying it explicitly. But Peter does not come out and say, hey, you know what, slavery, it demeans, it degrades people made in the image of God. It keeps Christians from living together as sisters and brothers on equal footing before Christ. He doesn't do that. And at the same time, Peter is bringing the gospel to people where slavery is already part of the social fabric. But later on, when you have European expansion taking place, and so, yeah, there was a slave trade in Africa and the Middle East, but then Europeans picked it up, and then people like Christopher Columbus, I've quoted in the past, at least in one sermon, Christopher Columbus was engaging in the slave trade, promoting it for, in the name of the Trinity. That's a different setting. That's where Christians or professed Christians begin to use these passages from Peter and Paul as a justification for slavery. Or in the U.S., those of the Confederacy, Confederate theologians using those passages to justify slavery. And so Peter wasn't writing them to justify slavery, but instead was recognizing the context in which he worked. And so for us then, we now live in this on the other side of slavery, and we can look back and say, yeah, that wasn't a good use of scripture. And so there are some similarities with first century Rome, living in a very urban society, multi-ethnic society, a society where Christians should be different from the dominant streams of culture. But at the same time, there's some big differences as well. Even though we've had some overlap with Peter and Paul, we'll be looking more specifically at their relationship, their collegiality, and at sometimes their conflicts. And then we'll be looking at Peter's legacy. So I want to thank you for being with me, and I want to end our time with Peter's blessing in this epistle. Peace to all of you who are in Christ.